So hello everyone and welcome back to the latest in our series of Big Think webinars for international school leaders, school owners and school groups. We're delighted you've joined us in what we hope will be a useful, informative and inspiring session that's all about thinking big about the future of international education. For those of you who have joined previous Big Thinks, you'll know how it works by now. But if you're joining us for the first time today, I'm Susie Williams of the International Schools team at Pearson, and I'll introduce you to today's lovely speaker who you can see at the top of your screen shortly. But before we get started, I'd just like to draw your attention to the chat box, which I know many of you have found, thank you, and the Q&A boxes. So if you've got any technical queries as you go along in the webinar, please do put those into the chat and we'll aim to resolve those for you. And then please use the Q&A box to submit any questions that you have on today's topic. There will be time at the end of the webinar for discussion and we'll aim to get through as many of those questions as possible. Finally, to help us understand a little bit more about you all here today, we've got a quick poll that's about to appear on your screens, and in it, we would like you to tell us what sort of international institution you are joining us from today and what your role is. So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to complete those two questions for us. It's really helpful for us to understand the profile of all of you delegates. Okay, right, so it looks like we've got 31% of our audience are joining us from schools offering a British curriculum, 19% IB, and 7% offering a mix. 21% of you are from school groups, and roles seem to be 31% principals or head of schools, members of the senior leadership team, and members of the teaching team as well. You are all very welcome, and thank you for completing that polling information. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Elaine Tan. Elaine is a senior learning designer within the Learning Research and Design team at Pearson and a lecturer at Mississippi State University. Elaine has a PhD in cognitive science and has a deep interest in understanding more about we as humans learn best. She has 11 years of teaching experience in cognitive and experimental psychology and is currently teaching cognitive psychology online. In this role and in her work at Pearson, she uses insights from cognitive and behavioural sciences to design effective learning experiences to improve learner outcomes. Welcome, Elaine, and over to you.
Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you, Susie, for such a lovely introduction. And I'm so honored to be here today and share the next 45 minutes with you. So happy to see everybody share where you're from. And I was so excited when I saw one of the first that introduced themselves from Malaysia. So I'm also originally from Malaysia, so that got me really excited. So really, really good to see all of you today. Thank you for joining me. So I want to just kick off the call with just to remind you a little bit about what was the session. So in the session descriptor, I posed this question to all of you. So I asked this question: what does a flipped classroom mean for you, your teaching staff, and your students? So in this session, we will reflect on and consider the pedagogical benefits and challenges, identify opportunities with much added value alongside some lessons learned, especially in the past 18 months, and also talk a little bit about some implementation recommendations. So before I go on, I like to start by having a poll and to have all of you share with me. I'm sorry, my thing is glitchy, just jumps forward. So I just want to share really quickly right now to start with a poll. Have all of you provide me with a rating of your current perception of what flipped classroom is. So using a scale of 1 through 5, 1 being extremely skeptical and 5 being ready to commit. I admit it's a rather odd range of perception descriptors, but I think it's enough to give me an idea of where we all stand with today's topic of flipped classroom. So again, you have about, take a couple moments, just your poll should pop up right now. So take a moment, consider what's your current perception and share with us your current rating. Okay, so I see the current results is almost half of us are currently in the mixed feelings, which is totally fine. I had my share of mixed feelings as well, but I also see a pretty good large share of us that is almost ready to commit. So we are kind of leaning towards the mixed feelings over to the right thing. So great. I'm eager to hear some of the reflection questions that I'm going to be asking you to share as well. So let's just kick off and start with some some introduction just to get all of us, in the right mindset of what we're talking about when we think about flipped classroom. So as many educators have found themselves adopting strategies of flipped classroom in the past year, and I've seen a rising trend of people embracing this learning model that brings its own added benefits that we will be talking about in a bit. But first, I just wanted to do a quick run through of what flipped classroom model is. So according to this definition, flipped classroom can be defined as events that have traditionally taken place inside the classroom now takes place outside the classroom and vice versa. And typically, they describe it with two complementary components in this learning model. First, the out-of-class learning. This component usually involves more computer-based individual instructions that typically include video lectures. And the goals of these instructional videos usually focus on having learners remember and understand the materials. So it can be supported by online discussions or any other means of online facilitations. So the purpose of this out-of-class learning is to essentially prepare students for this in-class learning component, which involve a lot of learning activities. And the goals of these activities now is to focus more on the application of the knowledge that we actually did impart to them in the out-of-class component, and usually involves a lot more solving more advanced problem solving together as a group. So the key piece here is that in this scenario, learning can be supported not only by the teacher, but also with your peers. So we're getting immediate feedback by your teachers and peers and solving things together and get this hands-on experience. So before we go in and start talking about what are some top learner benefits of these two learning components that build out what a flipped classroom model is, I want to pause again to have another reflection opportunity. So I invite you to think back on some recent interactions or experiences that you've had with flipped classroom, and particularly for those of you who also have mixed feelings right now. But think about what are some benefits that you notice, or even challenges that might have surfaced. So in this reflection, I would like you to take a couple moments, maybe share your thoughts and reflections with us using the chat pod that Susie pointed out earlier. So I will try my best to keep up. Excellent. So they're all popping up, and I'm doing my speed reading really terribly, but I do see some really emerging themes that we're going to be talking about today. So thank you all for sharing, and promise I will catch up with them a little bit better later as well. But the themes that I see emerging is that we get better engagement in class. We see that students are coming more prepared. They get to engage in classrooms. We also see that flip side of people worried about students not coming prepared. Then what do they do and things like that. And also, excellent. I feel like all of you are giving my webinars for me already, so that's perfect. And let's just kind of continue hoping to bring in all these points that you're talking about and brought up in this reflection when we talk about some following sections. So let's start with some benefits. So just a disclaimer here, this is by no means an exhaustive list of benefits, but just wanted to highlight some top benefits, starting with some research evidence that have shown that flipped classrooms have shown to improve learning outcomes because they, as you guys pointed out, increase student engagement and have that ability to boost that performance in the student learning. And a critical review for K-12 flipped classrooms actually compared some learning outcomes with the traditional teaching methodology, and they saw that flipped classroom approach can improve that student performance and or at least comparable to the traditional classroom. It was never worse. So it was either really added benefits and also, or at least equivalent to what traditional classroom can offer. So what other benefits of flipped classroom that I want to point out today? So one of my favorites, and some of you actually mentioned, was that it promotes learner agency. So it really does help create independent learners. So for example, in the out of class instructions, you have video instructions, students can actually pause, rewind, reflect on the materials in their own pace. And if you think more about what this point means, it's creating a very conducive learning environment that promotes students to self-reflect. And when they do that, they actually tend to build good study behaviors by being more self-aware of their memory and comprehension. And we all know that is actually a good skill, life skill to have when it comes to learning and studying more effectively. And when they do that and have good study habits, they tend to come to class a little bit more prepared so that they can have more deeper and meaningful engagement during the in-class component. And not only that students become more aware of their learning and engage more critically during the in-class sessions, teachers can also now gain additional insights based on just how well students are participating in this in-class component. So, if they see a student struggling, they can tell, like, oh, they can identify who are the students that might need extra help. So it actually gives teachers a little bit more time to adjust and see who their activities during the in-session class to make sure that they are addressing all the students. So we'll come back and elaborate a little bit more on the final point as well. So as the headline suggests, flipped classroom does benefit learners. However, it is not without its challenges. So similarly to some of the things that you've brought up in the chat pod, thank you for sharing again. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to highlight a few challenges to compare it against the benefits that we just talked about. Again, for this list, I am mainly going to only focus on the learner-related challenges for now. I will highlight a little bit of the teachers, but we'll talk a little bit more in the following section. So firstly, I want to talk about the attitudes and perceptions of flipped classroom. I put a quote here from a student that says, it just takes so much more time and effort. So there is this thing that mentality that, that I have to do all this prep work before I even have to go to class. And that leads to this idea of maintaining student engagement during out of class session as a challenge. So we all know that when you assign out-of-class activities, it does to students, it would require a certain level of discipline and commitment from the students. And also parents. I bring up parents here because some parents, I believe, and I know, shoulder some of these responsibilities as well because they have to make sure that their children are participating in these activities, especially with the younger children. And we know that it is not an easy task to monitor engagement asynchronously. I gave a very real example here as a screenshot of one of my video lectures, and I tend to use certain insights from my learning management systems to see how students are engaging with my video. As you can see in this trend, it is trending downwards. I lost my audience come somewhere around midway. I lost about half of them. And so this is an example, and it's not easy, especially because they're doing this on their own time. So you're not able to immediately catch why are they dropping, what is happening, and things like that. So these 2 points that I'm talking about right now really closely ties in to a teacher-related challenge, which is something that we strive to maintain this equal workload that we assign to students keeping it comparable to what we would do in a traditional classroom, because we need to be careful as to not overwhelm them by just saying, chucking everything as, okay, this is all you need to do before. And we run if you're not careful, these out-of-class activities can become a bit too overwhelming for the students at home, which then naturally leads to reports of dissatisfaction. And we have research that shows student actually prefers the traditional teaching method, and they report more of just some negative reactions to the change of instructional approach. But, as human nature, we don't like change. So that's at least, it's not, there are still ways to get the buy-in of students. And finally, just to highlight that available resources, that as many of you pointed out as well, technology support can be a big challenge as well for students. So now that we've discussed some of the benefits and challenges from the learner perspective, I want to shift a little bit focus to the teachers in my following section. Before I do that, I want to share one of my favorite quotes by an educational psychologist, David Ausubel. He said, "If I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learners already know. Ascertain this and teach him accordingly. Guarantee every teacher's North Star, and I hold this quote very close to my heart. And keeping that in mind, I want to take us through, talk through some learning activities learning opportunities that I feel a flipped classroom can offer. Okay, so it's a little bit of a heavy slide, but not to worry, I will walk you through them and give some examples. The first one on the learning opportunities that I talk about is creative ways to assess and collect insight on student learning. So we mentioned earlier with the in-class component, having it being very flexible and potentially for teachers to be able to really adjust real time. They have this rich environment where they can evaluate student learning. So they don't only have to just rely on just homeworks that they assign to their students at home. They can use really live, interactions and just insights to be able to have a better idea of where their students are. And like earlier we mentioned, being able to also tell if which students are struggling where and what. And with that assessments in class, they can do a real-time meaningful adjustments to help address those needs, the current needs, and make changes along the way to see how they can help their students in that given lesson. And because that students come prepared, or majority of the students might come prepared with some studying ahead of time, you have this dedicated time where you can engage students in very student-centered interaction. So you're not just standing in front and just talking at them. Engage them in a very interactive way, and that creates environment that just promotes much better higher order cognitive problem solving. And they can plan interactive activities that end up building collaborative problem solving and communication skills, which we all know are really important life skills. So I just want to pause one moment here to just say I could probably share and travel down each of these bullet points and go down the rabbit hole. But I just want to be conscious of time and just the main coverage of this session, but definitely be happy to elaborate on any of these points if you have any further questions during the Q&A later or any follow-up post sessions or communication. Okay, so the next part that I kind of put side by side with these learning opportunities is just this reflection piece, a reminder from what we've learned in the last 18 months. And I think this is a good moment to just think about what are some things that we saw during this, we call it the rush to digital when we had the close down of pandemic, everything but one thing I wanted to point out is that I feel like we were all reminded that as humans, we were very adaptable and creative beings, because I saw, even given the constraints, that teachers were adapting, creatively using all these tools to just keep maintaining this learning environment that was helpful for their students. So with that in mind, I want to challenge you to also just reflect with your teachers and your students on what worked well online and in person. For example, here I put, because this is not the only one, like for an online component, we talked earlier about how it supports that whole learner agency. Students are able to self-pace their video and they can do it on their own schedule. So that's a good benefit for them to reflect and come prepared for class. And the in-person component, we all know, is always better at promoting being present and engaging in a meaningful discussions, because sometimes it's hard when you're just teaching to a Zoom class of just black names. I mean, just names without a video, so you don't have any features. So I'm really glad of Susie smiling at me. So that's also really encouraging as I keep going and talking to myself here. But so just think about what worked best for each of these learning environments for your students and use that to your advantage. And the other thing that I wanted is more of a reminder, and just to remind all of us that we're all doing the best that we can given these circumstances, and just be mindful of our well-being, and just know that any, whatever decisions that we make, there might be some added stress and pressure. So just be mindful of that. I just added like a few quick statistics that I found recently, where close to half of the parents surveyed by the United States Center Disease for Control and Prevention reported increased stress levels when their children were doing virtual learning. And in a separate national-wide poll in the United States, 80% of parents reported that their children were experiencing heightened stress levels. So just a reminder that, just be mindful, check in with each other, and, keep reflecting. And yeah. Okay, so on that note, let's take another pause and get you to reflect on, I know some of you have already shared, but now that we are at this point, I just want you to think about what is the biggest concern when you're evaluating the benefits of flipped classrooms? I feel I'm catching up from the previous chats, and there are a lot already that came in, so I will let it trickle in, but the ones that I've seen so far seems to be in line with the themes that we are going to be talking about teacher workload and even just cost and technical issues. So let's just get and how to create balance. I like that. Thank you for, so now. Okay, so when it comes to weighing the costs to properly implement flipped classroom, there are a few top cost consideration. The first one I want to highlight is a human cost. It involves your teachers. And this is where there is like a considerable amount of teacher workload involved, a really huge time commitment and effort that is going to be needed because of how the materials generation and just the implementation. And it's going to take a little bit of planning in order to produce and curate digital content that aligns to learning goals of the lesson. So as we all, again, this kind of ties back to our reflection of like how we did this in the last 18 months and how much effort and time that takes. And if we really want to do it properly and make sure we are creating videos that or instructional material that really engage your students, because the second point is like acknowledging that there is the lack of monitoring ability that actually translates to having to figure out certain ways that you need to incorporate into your videos to maintain the attention of your learners. So one thing before I move on to highlight is that I put a little note that says initial, because I want to highlight that this is a much heavier lift in the initial stages, because when you're creating these things, videos, it takes a lot more time with planning and recording and videoing, but you can always reuse them later on or make it better so you have something to work off with. So in the beginning, it does feels like a much heavier lift. So one of the three next points that I want to talk about, and I think most people actually brought up as well, is in relation to institution support. Like we want to, especially the technology, because in order to really implement flipped classroom, you'll need to invest in some technology to support your teachers. You will need to provide training and support for both your teachers and students as well, just so that someone actually just mentioned like technology issues, like that is a big thing, and also not to forget that you'll also be supporting students who are limited by technology resources. So some students might not be able to afford a computer or not have fast internet. So we need to be creative and think about what are some ways that you can still support them and have them still reap the benefits of flipped classroom model. So using this flipped classroom visualization from earlier, I'm going to color code the opportunities and cost comparisons. So, I was there already. So the opportunities are in green and the cost in red. So, okay, this is a bird's eye view of what I want to call a cost-benefit analysis comparison, if I can even call it that, but just wanted to highlight that most of the cost appears on the left-hand side, where these it is mainly to support more of the out-of-class learning, that there's like a lot of heavy lift, but again, it is a lot of them are really in the initial stages. But with this point as well, I want to say that you also don't have to worry about having to do it all at once. Like we're going to follow up a little bit on this in the next section. So even though it's a very heavy initial list with the planning and wanting to know what to implement, it will actually produce much added benefit for a more enriched learning experience for the students. As we can see, it's all green on the right-hand side, and you can see how with engaging activities way up the cognitive processing level, more interactivity will really improve learning outcomes. So now that we think about the costs, benefits, and challenges, it kind of brings me to this wrap up section that I want to cover, taking into consideration all that we've discussed in this session. I want to share some implementation recommendations. So firstly, I put up here is communicate clearly with your teachers, students, parents, or any other parties that who will be involved to align expectations and goals. So this is so that your teachers, your students all know what to expect for this transition. So we are all aligned on our goals, we are all aligned expectations, so we know, talk through the benefits and challenges. And this can also help you be mindful of just everyone's well-being and just prepare and support them through this change. And to support that, we want to recommend that you create a feedback culture where your teachers, staff can constantly seek feedback from each other and students, and in order to just adjust accordingly and incrementally. So I highlighted the word accordingly and incrementally because the point I touched on earlier where I said, yes, the costs were all on the left-hand side with the reds, but I also mentioned that we don't have to do it all at once. I say this because even in our traditional teaching classroom planning, we adjust our lessons plans with teaching goals by semester throughout the year. It took me 3 years. I remember when I taught my first class where I adjusted, made changes, make sure that it was the best I could do for my students. So we do that too, even for traditional class. So we should also think about that in terms of how we can implement flipped classroom by the stages. And additionally, with every term, we have different dynamic of students, especially now, post-pandemic. We would have a different group of students with different mindset, different experiences in their online and in class. So just be mindful of that, and just a reminder to be open to adjustments and just incrementally make the move over to flipped classroom. And I don't want to be too prescriptive here, but at the same time, also want to give you a concrete example of what I mean by incremental changes. So one way you can think about this is that you can start by working with your teachers, work on a plan to move lessons over to flip methodology in stages. So based on your teacher's experiences with the materials and their class content, they will already have a pretty good idea of which lessons would benefit most with a flipped classroom model. And you can start there, and then you can work your way through. So it kind of ties into the next point, where you just keep learning and reflecting together. So make sure you provide teachers with the necessary training so they also know how to best take advantage of all these opportunities that are available with the model, with the technology, so they themselves also are equipped to guide their students to interact with out-of-class materials more effectively. And the next point I have here is to rely on external resources to help lessen your teacher workload. So in line with the example I gave earlier, if your teachers are not able to flip all your lessons at once, maybe because of time constraints, not a lot of time to plan, it's okay. Consider what external resources are available that you can use right now to support them as they build up their own library of resources that they can use in upcoming semesters. So, and next one, be deliberate when deciding on technology and methodology to invest in first. So consider all of these aspects that we discussed today: learning goals, what are the outcomes that you want to achieve, what are some opportunities, and also not forgetting the challenges and the costs that involve. So just kind of do some cost-benefit analysis in your own way based on the learning and goals that you and your teachers and students have come to an agreement on. Okay. And finally, and I think quite importantly, always consider your learners first. Like focus on how best to support their learning outcomes. So that's how I always approach my work and my teaching, is that if I focus on the learners, everything else will fall in place. Might sound a little bit ambitious, but that's something I like to hold on to. Okay, so just to wrap up, communicate clearly, create a feedback culture, continue to learn and reflect together with your teachers and students, rely on external resources as you build your own, be deliberate in your considerations and decision making, and finally, and most importantly, always consider your learners first. Okay, So that is all the wealth content that I have with you. But before I end this officially, I wanted to check in with you again. And using the same rating skills as before, I just wanted to check in. What is your current confidence in implementing flipped classroom? Okay, I think I might have adjusted the trend positively. Sorry, that was like a excited sign. Thank you for your honesty and your attention. I really appreciated your sharing and all of your participation in the chat. So I will definitely be catching up. And in the meantime, I will be passing it on to Susie to kick off the Q&A.
Thank you, Elaine. That's lovely to see everybody's mind shift there from feeling mixed feelings and a little bit skeptical. There was definitely a shift. So I'm going to celebrate that positive move with you as well. So whilst you've been talking, we have had some questions in through the Q&A box. So thank you if you've submitted one. We will get to as many as we can. So if you've still got a burning question you'd like Elaine's expertise on, do please pop it into the Q&A box now. The first two, I think, are linked, Elaine, but don't feel that you have to take them together. But I'll ask you them both together. And if you want to deal with them as one, then do so. So the first one is, how would it impact a student if all of their teachers used a flipped method continuously? And then the second one is, are there any circumstances where the flipped model would not work? For example, age of students, level, subject, etc.
Sorry, I think I might need the repeat of the first question. Did you say something about, go ahead.
Yeah, the first question was, how would it impact a student if all of their teachers used a flipped classroom method continuously?
Okay, so I'm going to tackle that one first, because I think I'm imagining that question saying that if like I have 5 subjects and all of them are doing flipped, and I have now 5 extra hours that I have to do every night. So I think definitely time is a big thing, and it is going to be really scary. I wouldn't, that's why one of the top challenge that I highlighted was that it's going to be really overwhelming, so we have to be very careful. So in that case, I would recommend that the teachers come together to really just come up with a plan to make sure that, okay, if, let's start with how many hours are we, again, this is just not meant to be prescriptive, but a concrete example to say maybe we are expecting students to spend X number of hours interacting with the material. So how do we divvy it up between all of us, and just start that? And then, maybe some weeks you might say, oh, I need more time because my chapter or my lesson would require a lot more planning. Then maybe they get extra time. So I would think that we would maybe have a little bit more coordination among the teachers, so we are not just putting it all on the students to just like figure it out. You have to do all of these things. That, and then I might have forgotten the second question.
That's okay. I was just going to say, just add to that, is that we've had some feedback that teachers who have looked at, or leaders who have looked at a flipped classroom model, have taken one subject area that they think particularly lends itself to it and tasked their teaching staff within that subject area to try the flipped classroom approach. And then they've had their staff that have used it to feed back to the rest of the teaching staff as almost like a prototype example. So you can get a sense of what the commitment is in terms of time and how much student time. So potentially it's something that you could consider, presumably, a subject at a time.
Absolutely. I think that answers the second question, doesn't it? Like why I think I remember the question now. Is like, are there some situations where flipped classroom are a little bit more beneficial than not? So similar to what Susie mentioned, is that maybe some really hands-on, that require a lot more problem solving, maybe that can learn collaboratively. I feel like that can really benefit a student's way to like, because sometimes when you're just reading certain subjects, I'm trying to think of something right now that is one or better than the other, but I feel like it might be a little bit unfair because I only do cognitive psychology classes, so I feel a little bit unfair if I'm using some real examples, but definitely reflect on what worked well or not. So maybe one of the recommendations was like, what in the past year and a half, what would really worked well for some classes in an online setting or not? Maybe use that information, gather those data and compare, and maybe with that information pick a prototype subject to say, let's try it out. And then using that teacher's reflection and learnings, they can help the other teachers adjust as well, and try to plan for future.
Okay. Linked slightly to that, there's a question in the chat from earlier when you were asking for contributions from people, from Laura asking what sort of benefits are there for early years. So I guess that's that, we can all understand that there's benefits for older learners, perhaps the secondary age learners, to be able to really run with this and work independently on the work that they're tasked with doing prior to coming into the classroom to discuss it. But does that still translate into an effective learning methodology for early years learners?
Yes, I really do think so, because I actually have a really good example of, I say really good because it's like I was talking to my manager recently about this, and her son was also doing some pre-work homework at home, and the teacher actually said, hey, I need you to only spend 20 minutes on this homework. And he understood that the reason he did that was so that teachers, when he go to the class, teacher could say, oh, I see that you're struggling with this question. So even a young learner at that age was able to see the benefit of doing this pre-work, that they can help teachers, give teachers insights on what is needed. So definitely a short answer. Sorry, that was like a really specific example there, but a short answer, yes, I definitely do see the benefits for early young learners as well.
Brilliant. And that ties in with a question that Lucas has asked us, which is how do you see it working in a primary school context where students are not so independent as in secondary? So I think we've answered that one, haven't we? So that's good. Hopefully that's a good answer. The next question we've got is from Jeremy Adkins, who's asking, is the flipped classroom strategy meant to work in tandem with the school's curriculum and or more over certain platforms?
Do you think the platform in that question meant like technology platforms, or?
I'm guessing so, because obviously there's a platform requirement that you've got an online learning mechanism, but potentially it could be talking about things like, I don't know, the Pearson online schooling services or some other specific bought-in bespoke platform that would allow that sort of collaborative work.
Okay, well, I think that just from the trend that we were sharing with you today, I feel like there is, you can use it in both ways, right? You can use it as like this, I'm going to turn everything flipped. I'm going to make sure my course is really, using that in class to really benefit the learners, in engaging them in very, meaningful and deep problem solving, and benefit from peer-to-peer learning as well. So that could be mainly, but at the same time, if we are not able to commit to that right now, we can also use it in tandem to what we have, pick some of the topics and lessons that we feel can really benefit right now. Let's start there, and then we learn from there. So I think my answer would be like, I feel like it's not one or the other. It could work in both ways, depending on how you want to leverage the advantages of this model.
Okay, brilliant. Another question here, how often do you use a flipped classroom? So let's just consider that from your perspective. Yeah, how often do you use that? I mean, you're teaching online all the time at the moment.
Yeah. So now, because I'm fully online, so I haven't done it in the last 2 years. But in the past, especially when I was doing more like experimental psychology, which is more lab based, I think fairly often, because I really needed students to come and have that idea, know what we're doing, and before we can actually go into the experiments, like how can we think about it? So I don't know if fairly often is an acceptable answer in this case, but I would say fairly often, just because given that subject matter at hand that I was trying to teach at. Yeah.
And I think that's an important point, isn't it? As a teacher, you know intuitively, and everybody on this webinar will know intuitively which of their topics will lend themselves to a flipped classroom approach. I mean, you guys are the experts. You understand how your students learn best, and you can understand how to inspire them in that way. And I've got another question here. So it can be done in an online setting as well, right?
I think in this case, like I tried to like make the distinction, because when you read past research and stuff, they have really like make it really clear where they have this in person, because you can do it online as well with the synchronous online thing. But yes, so I feel like a version of it could, but I don't know if the true purists of flipped classroom would get me in trouble if I said that. But I actually think that even with my fully online class, I still use those elements. Like I know certain topics where students are really excited about when I talk about attention chapter in my psychology class, we love to talk about driving and texting, watching television while studying. So a lot of that in-class discussion and just like, critical thinking definitely come in. I use that element in my online class as well, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, we've got just 1 minute now, so I'm going to wrap it up there and say thank you to everybody for the questions that you've asked in the Q&A box. There were a few questions around certificates of attendance, so I'll come to that in a second. But I just would like to say thank you to Elaine and to everybody who's joined us here today. It's been a really informative and enjoyable webinar. We've had lots of positive comments about the great ideas that you've shared, so thank you. Just on certificates, so we will share the certificates of attendance and a link to the recording of this webinar by email with you tomorrow. We're also now issuing digital certifications for our big webinar thinks. You can see that on the slides now. So you will receive via email tomorrow a badge, an email invite inviting you to claim your Big Think digital badge. And you can add it to your LinkedIn profile, and you can save it to build a set of badges showing the professional development webinars you've attended with Pearson International Schools. So we hope that that will be useful to you. And before we close today's webinar, I would just like to give a quick plug for the next Big Think, which takes place on Thursday, the 21st of October. And in that one, Dr. John Taylor of Cranley School will be discussing future-ready project learning as a route to developing creative, flexible and innovative learners. Registration for that webinar is now open on the Big Think webpage, and I do hope you can join us for that one. And finally, please do complete our post-webinar survey, which will appear automatically at the end of this webinar when you click leave. Your feedback is really important to us, so do let us know what you think. So all that remains to say is thank you again. Thank you, Elaine, and have a great rest of the week, everybody. Bye-bye.